In 2025, Dubai International Airport handled 95.2 million passengers, 3 consecutive record years. The world's busiest international airport by passenger volume, and pulling away from every competitor. CEO Paul Griffiths stood in front of the industry and forecast 99.5 million passengers for 2026. The symbolic 100 million milestone was not a question of whether, it was a question of which month. Then, February 28 arrived, and in March 2026, Dubai International handled 2.5 million passengers. Not 9 million, not 7 million, 2.5 million. A 65.7% collapse in a single month. And within days of the crisis beginning, 13 major international airlines announced suspension after suspension after suspension. British Airways, Air France, Singapore Airlines, KLM, Lufthansa, Cathay Pacific, Air Canada, Finnair, one after another. Most people watching those announcements asked one question: why did they leave? That is the wrong question. The right question is this: could they have stayed? The answer, and almost nobody has explained this clearly, is no. They had no choice. And understanding why they had no choice tells you something about Dubai's situation that no airline press release will ever say out loud. To understand what was lost, you first need to feel the scale of what existed. Dubai's geographic position is genuinely unique in aviation terms. Sitting at the crossroads between Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia, Dubai is within an 8-hour flight of roughly 2/3 of the world's population. That is not marketing language. That is a geographic fact that no amount of money can replicate elsewhere. Emirates understood this before almost anyone else and built an airline around it. Not a point-to-point carrier connecting 2 cities, a hub machine. A system designed to take a passenger from Manchester and connect them to Nairobi, to Mumbai, to Sydney, to Bangkok, through one airport, on one layover, with one airline managing the connection. The model worked at a scale that redefined what a hub airport could be. 95.2 million passengers in 2025. More than Heathrow, more than Charles de Gaulle, more than Singapore Changi, more than any other international airport on the planet. The layover that became the destination itself. Passengers who once endured connections now chose them, because Dubai offered enough in the terminal and enough in the surrounding city that the stop felt like part of the journey rather than an interruption of it. International carriers from every corner of the world wanted a piece of that traffic. British Airways flew 3 daily Dubai services. Singapore Airlines built frequency on the route. Air France connected Paris to the Gulf hub with reliable regularity. The ecosystem was complete, and it felt permanent. Have you ever assumed something was permanent because it had been working perfectly for long enough? That is exactly what the aviation industry assumed about Dubai. Now here is the mechanism that changed everything. And I want to explain this clearly because almost nobody outside the aviation industry understands how it actually works. When a conflict begins in a region where commercial aircraft operate, the question of whether airlines can continue flying is not left to individual carriers to decide. It is decided by regulators. In Europe, that regulator is EASA, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency. EASA issues what are called Conflict Zone Information Bulletins, CZIBs. These are not suggestions, they are not advisories that airlines can weigh against their own risk assessment. They are instructions. On July 14, 2026, EASA issued CDIB 2026-07. The bulletin instructed all EASA-regulated airlines to avoid UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar airspace at every altitude. Every altitude. Not just certain flight levels, not just certain corridors. Every altitude. The entire airspace. Off limits. The reason given was precise. Unpredictable military developments, combined with the possible use of missiles, drones, combat aircraft, and air defense systems. And here is the detail that most coverage missed entirely. This bulletin applies not just to European airlines. It applies to any non-European airline holding EASA third country operator authorization, which means Singapore Airlines, regulated in Singapore but holding EASA authorization to operate into European destinations, falls under the same instruction. British Airways has no choice. Singapore Airlines has no choice. Air France has no choice. KLM, Lufthansa, Cathay Pacific, no choice. The bulletin removed the option. Now here is the question everyone asks next. If the airspace is that dangerous, why is Emirates still flying? The answer is not what most people assume. Emirates is not flying because it is braver than British Airways. Emirates is flying because it answers to a completely different regulator. UAE-based airlines, Emirates, Etihad, FlyDubai, operate under the UAE General Civil Aviation Authority, the GCAA, a completely separate regulatory framework with no connection to EASA. The GCAA lifted all precautionary measures on May 2, 2026. And under GCA rules, Emirates and its UAE counterparts were cleared to resume. Same airspace, two different regulators, two completely different outcomes. British Airways cannot fly to Dubai, not because Dubai is unsafe by one measure, but because the regulatory framework that governs British Airways says it cannot. And that framework, EASA, has three conditions that must all be present simultaneously before it will lift the bulletin. First, the bulletin itself must be lifted or eased. Second, war risk insurers must restore affordable coverage for Gulf operations. Third, sustained regional stability must be demonstrated over a sufficient period. All three simultaneously. Not two of three, all three. Right now, none of the three are fully in place. The October suspension dates that airlines like British Airways and Singapore Airlines have filed, October 25, October 24, are not promises of return. They are operational buffers, planning horizons that allow airlines to manage crew scheduling and slot allocation while waiting to see whether EASA extends the bulletin again. EASA has renewed the bulletin repeatedly since February 28. The October dates may move. This channel exists to explain the mechanisms behind the headlines, the regulatory architecture, the insurance systems, the structural forces that most coverage never gets to. Subscribe now, because the next section is where we go airline by airline and show you exactly what 13 suspensions actually look like on the ground. British Airways. Before February 28th, 3 daily flights between London Heathrow and Dubai. 3. That frequency represents a serious commercial commitment, not a test service, a mature, high-yield route with premium cabin passengers, corporate accounts, and connecting traffic that British Airways had spent years building. The plan for resumption is 1 daily flight, not 3. 1. And the Jeddah route. Permanently cancelled, not suspended, cancelled. British Airways is not returning to its pre-crisis Dubai operation. It is returning to a reduced version of it. And the difference between 3 daily flights and 1 daily flight is not just about seat count. It is about slot holdings, crew basing, connecting itinerary availability, and the corporate travel accounts that chose British Airways for Dubai, specifically because the frequency made scheduling flexible. Singapore Airlines originally told passengers it would resume by August 2, then extended to October 24. The Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore, conducting stringent flight corridor audits before any resumption is approved. Meanwhile, Singapore Airlines launched a new Riyadh route, originally planned for earlier in 2026. That launch has been pushed to December 1. And Singapore Airlines is rerouting its remaining Gulf-adjacent operations via northern corridors, accepting significant fuel penalties on every sector to stay within EASA-compliant airspace. Air France, the first major European carrier to attempt resumption, restarted operations on July 27, 2026. But read the statement carefully. Air France said resumption would remain subject to an assessment of the security situation locally, which is rapidly evolving. Rapidly evolving. That is not a confident return. That is a weekly security committee meeting deciding whether today's flights take off. There is no confirmed restart date. There is no schedule guarantee. Air France is flying when the assessment says fly and stopping when it says stop. KLM suspended through August 23. Lufthansa and Swiss suspended until September 13 for Dubai specifically. Cathay Pacific, Dubai and Riyadh both suspended to late October. Air Canada, October 24th resumption date. Finnair, Dubai suspended to October 24th, and the Doha suspension extended through the entire winter season to March 27th, 2027. 13 airlines, one regulatory instrument, one airport simultaneously losing the international carrier diversity that made it the world's busiest hub. Did you know before today that British Airways and Emirates answer to different regulators, and that is the entire reason one is flying and one isn't? Now, let's look at what Emirates is actually doing while 13 international carriers are suspended. More than 1,300 weekly flights to 137 destinations across 72 countries. 75% of its pre-conflict schedule restored. Emirates is not just operating. It is aggressively rebuilding its network, taking advantage of reduced competition at its own hub, capturing passengers who would previously have connected through Dubai on a European or Asian carrier. Imagine being a passenger trying to get from London to Mumbai right now. British Airways' Dubai connection is suspended. Your alternative is a longer routing via another hub, adding hours and complexity to a journey that used to be efficient. Or you rebook on Emirates directly, which is flying and which, right now, faces significantly less competition than it did 6 months ago. Every suspended Western carrier is, in the short term, a commercial gift to Emirates. The hub that was designed around competition between dozens of international carriers, a competitive ecosystem that benefited passengers through pricing and scheduling options, is temporarily running as a near-monopoly hub for UAE carriers. That is not a conspiracy. It is the straightforward consequence of two regulatory frameworks producing two different operational outcomes. But here is the longer-term question that the Emirates advantage obscures. The 13 suspended airlines were not just bringing passengers to Dubai. They were bringing connecting passengers through Dubai. Passengers from Europe connecting to Asia. Passengers from Africa connecting to North America. The complex web of itineraries that made Dubai's 95 million passenger figure possible in the first place. Emirates alone cannot replicate that connecting traffic at the same volume. Not because Emirates lacks capacity, but because those connecting passengers chose their itineraries based on the full menu of international carrier options. When the menu shrinks, some of them find different routes entirely, routes that don't go through Dubai at all. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next section is where the structural shift that was already happening before the crisis becomes impossible to ignore. Here is something the aviation industry had been quietly discussing for years before February 28, 2026. The Boeing 787 and the Airbus A350 changed the economics of long-haul aviation. These aircraft are efficient enough to make direct routes commercially viable that were previously impossible. London to Perth direct, London to Osaka direct. Routes that once required a hub stop, which often meant Dubai, can now be flown point to point. The Gulf hub model was already facing a structural question before any conflict arrived. If passengers can fly direct, why stop? The crisis accelerated that question into an operational reality. British Airways, with its Dubai and Gulf services suspended, has been deploying its surplus A350 and 787 capacity to India routes. Delhi, Mumbai, Bengaluru, Nairobi, routes that don't require Gulf airspace. Routes that, in some cases, were already growing before the suspension gave them additional aircraft. Singapore Airlines has been reallocating capacity to intra-Asia and Australian markets during the Gulf suspension period. These are not temporary workarounds. They are redeployments of assets into markets that are generating revenue right now. When the EASA bulletin eventually lifts, and it will lift at some point, the question is not just whether British Airways wants to return to 3 daily Dubai flights. The question is whether the aircraft are available, whether the crew are based in the right places, whether the revenue those aircraft are generating on their current routes justifies pulling them back to a Gulf operation that will require rebuilding its corporate accounts and connecting itinerary base from a lower starting point than before. The crisis didn't create the structural shift toward direct routes and away from Gulf transit. It gave it momentum. And momentum, in aviation as in everything else, is easier to maintain than to reverse. Do you think British Airways will return to 3 daily Dubai flights, or has something permanently changed in how airlines think about this route? Before we close, there is a part of this story that never appears in the aviation industry coverage. The people who made 95 million passengers a year operationally possible. The check-in staff, the ground handlers, the baggage loaders, the aircraft caterers, the maintenance engineers, the immigration officers processing 260,000 passengers a day in normal operations. When 13 international carriers suspend, the human infrastructure built around their operations contracts immediately. Tens of thousands of hospitality workers placed on unpaid standby. Tour operators cancelling packages and redirecting groups to Istanbul, Bangkok, Singapore. International conferences that were booked into Dubai hotels, choosing alternative venues that won't involve passengers navigating suspended flight routes and elevated ticket prices. The migrant workers, the 92% of Dubai's population with no permanent stake and no social safety net, faced a specific cruelty that the airline suspension statistics don't capture. UAE carriers, facing dramatically reduced competition on routes they normally share with international airlines, charged prices that reflected their temporary monopoly position. Tickets that previously cost a few $100s, the flights that workers used to travel home for family emergencies or annual leave, jumped to 3 and 4 times normal prices. The people who could afford the increase, the corporate traveler, the wealthy expat, the business passenger with a company travel budget, the people who could not, the hotel staffer, the construction worker, the retail employee trying to get home to the Philippines or Nepal or India. The aviation crisis did not hurt everyone equally. It concentrated its worst effects on the people with the least ability to absorb them. Dubai International Airport is open. Emirates is flying 1,300 weekly flights. 75% of the pre-conflict schedule is restored. The infrastructure survived, the runways are intact, the terminals are operational. The geographic advantage that made this airport the world's busiest has not moved. But 13 international carriers are still suspended. And British Airways, when it returns, is planning 1 daily flight to Dubai, where it previously operated 3. Not as a temporary measure while it rebuilds, as the new schedule. That reduction is the most honest number in this entire story. Not the 65.7% collapse in March. That was a crisis figure. Extreme, temporary, visually dramatic. The British Airways frequency reduction is different. That is a carrier looking at the post-crisis Dubai market and deciding that one daily flight is the right commercial answer where 3 was previously justified. That decision reflects something quieter and more durable than a crisis. It reflects a recalibration of what Dubai is worth in a world where EASA regulatory architecture can remove Western carriers from the airspace entirely, where new generation aircraft make the Gulf transit stop less necessary than it was, and where the confidence that sustained premium frequency has to be rebuilt from a lower base. The world's busiest international airport may well reclaim that title, but it will reclaim it differently than it held it before. Here is what I want to leave you with. Not about airlines, not about regulatory frameworks, about the things in your own life that feel permanent because they've been working smoothly for long enough. What in your life do you assume is stable, that actually depends on a framework someone else controls entirely? Your income, your industry, your city's economic health, your career trajectory. How many of those things would change, not because you made a different decision, but because a regulator, an insurer, or an institution you've never heard of changed theirs? British Airways didn't choose to leave Dubai. A bulletin from a regulatory agency in Cologne removed the option. And Dubai, the city that built the world's busiest airport, had no say in it. Do you think British Airways will ever return to 3 daily Dubai flights? Or has something permanently shifted in how airlines think about the Gulf? Tell me below.